Tracy Clayton is another black person, and she writes for BuzzFeed. And in 2015, she wrote an article called 29 Things White People Ruined. Well, number 29 is basically everything. In case she'd forgotten anything in the first 28, number 29, the conclusion was basically everything. We ruined it. And here's Assad Haider. He's of Middle Eastern origin, but he seems to have adopted the minority view really quite rapidly. And let me quote from him. He says, "Difficult as it is for people of color like me to come to terms with, we're not about to get rid of white people. This country is full of them. They are an intrinsically reactionary force. The relevant question is how to subdue this reactionary force." So here's an immigrant that comes to the country, and he's dismayed to find that it's full of white people. He can't think of some practical way to get rid of us, but eventually they're going to subdue us. I wonder how they plan to do that. And of course, Hispanics have been getting in on this act for quite some time. Rudy Martinez of Texas State University, I think some of you saw the article that he wrote for his school paper, and the title was, "Your DNA is an Abomination." Well, that's our DNA, of course. And his message for white people, "I hate you because you shouldn't exist." Well, surprisingly, there was actually some criticism of this column at campus, and the editor of the school paper, another Hispanic, printed an apology. And she conceded, "We acknowledge that the column could have been clearer in its message." Well, I don't see how it could have been any clearer than, "I hate you because you shouldn't exist." Anyway, now here's another Hispanic professor, Albert Ponce, writing about what he calls the abolition of white democracy, which he says is just another name for white supremacy. He writes this: "Abolition means we must destroy white democracy, not reform it. No voting is going to help. We need to smash white supremacy." Now, there is plenty more of this kind of thing. It doesn't take much effort to find sentiments of this kind percolating through the internet and in places like the New York Times. And I honestly don't know how representative it is. Some people might say, this is just crazy intellectual stuff. These people don't speak for the mass of blacks or Hispanics. However, have you ever heard a non-white person say, "Actually, I kind of like white people. I think white people are really working hard to establish an equal society"? Have you ever heard any of them, even one of them, say such a thing? I haven't. And I would note that we get this kind of spiteful talk about us while we are still the majority. I mean, when Ta-Nehisi Coates and people like him become the majority, I don't think they're suddenly going to decide that white people aren't so bad after all. And once they're in charge, I think they probably will come up with imaginative ways to, as they say, subdue us. Now, there is a certain logic in what these people are doing. They want what I have, what we have. And it makes sense for them to describe us in these abominable terms because it justifies their taking what we have, whether it's our wealth, whether it's our culture, whether it's our country. We're a reactionary force, our DNA is an abomination, we can't be trusted, we have a demon religion. All of that makes sense for people who want what we have. Well, okay, they're not fond of us, they want to dispossess us. There's nothing unusual in that. People have been wanting what other folks had ever since there have been people. This is part of the human condition. But this attempt for us to live with black people has produced a much more mystifying and surprising consequence, and that is that it produces mental illness in white people. For example, what are we to make to the millions of white people who adore Ta-Nehisi Coates and have made him a millionaire as a consequence of his contempt for us? And here's a fellow, a white person by the name of Frank Joyce, who writes regularly for Salon.com. And here's the title of one of his columns: "White men must be stopped. The very future of mankind depends on it." As he writes, "The future of life on the planet depends on bringing the 500-year rampage of the white man to a halt. Now, guess what he says? The central problem is white supremacy. And he goes on to say, white racism distorts how we think about virtually everything. Now, white people wouldn't write this kind of craziness if they were not trying to live in a multiracial society. But because we are engaged in this ill-fated and futile attempt to live together, we find white people saying all kinds of crazy things. That, for example, the First Amendment has got to be amended so there can be no more hate speech, which is to say anything that might hurt the feelings of a non-white person. There are lots of white people out there who think that just about everything that is said at this conference, from Professor Whitman on down, has all been hate speech and, in fact, should be banned by law. A lot of them think that. And they would not turn into these obscurantist censors if it were not for this crazy attempt to build a multiracial society. And some of the stuff just gets downright common. There are white people who will tell you that farmers' markets are racist. The scientific method is racist. Objective qualifications for jobs are racist. Math is Eurocentric and has to be modified. Again, you wouldn't get this kind of spectacular foolishness if we lived in a racially coherent society. Now, I have a name for this new mental disease that I've discovered. I think we should call it race-induced cognitive disorder. And it is unique to white people. And I have a number of favorite patients who suffer from this disease, one of whom is George W. Bush. And you will recall that after Hurricane Katrina, there were some complaints about how he didn't get federal aid down there in time to New Orleans. And Kanye West got on television and called him a racist for not having hustled down there quick enough. Well, after his terms as president were over, George W. Bush, looking back on those 8 years, said that was the worst moment of his entire presidency. Now, here's a guy who was president during the 2001 terror attacks. He led the country into the worst recession since the great crisis of the 20s. He's the guy who got us into this utterly pointless, expensive, crazy war in Iraq. All of these things he went through, but for some tin pot entertainer to call him a racist was the worst experience in his entire presidency. This is a form of insanity. And of course, the latest example of how this project of multiracialism unhinges the minds of whites will be on spectacular coast-to-coast display on May 29th, just 1 month from now, when Starbucks closes all 8,000 of its stores so that 175,000 employees can spend an afternoon having white privilege and white guilt shoved down their throats. Now, this is going to cost them an estimated $12 million in lost revenue, and I'm sure it's going to be a very pleasant payday for Eric Holder and for Jonathan Greenblatt of the ADL, who are going to help design this curriculum to help white people overcome their unconscious stereotypes. But there's an aspect of this I just don't understand. Isn't the whole idea of unconscious bias and sensitivity training to overcome stereotypes of this kind so that we can see Muslims commit terrorist acts time after time after time, but we know better than to conclude that this says anything in general about Islam? We have to overcome that stereotype. And blacks may be arrested at 12 to 15 times the white rate for mugging, but if we find ourselves in a black neighborhood and watch our backs, that's a stereotype we must overcome. Overcoming stereotypes is what we're put on earth to do. However, just one manager at Starbucks allegedly does something bad. Let's assume she does something. Just one. And that means that all 175,000 employees have to go through all this anti-stereotyping. Now, do I detect some kind of stereotype here? Just one manager does something allegedly wrong, and all of them might be bad. Every single white person might be bad. This exercise in fighting stereotypes is nothing more than an affirmation, a huge, deafening affirmation of the one remaining negative stereotype that is acceptable, which is the racist white person. Now, Starbucks management probably can't even begin to understand this because it has to do with this tragic, ill-fated attempt on which we've launched to build a multiracial society. When it comes to race, Otherwise, intelligent people behave like morons. There's another problem. And that has to do with the fact that as we keep going down this road to nowhere, trying to make something work that does not work, we find we have to jettison standards that white people take for granted because blacks and Hispanics are not able or refuse to live up to those standards. I mean, there are lots of little examples around the country. Take fare beating, jumping the turnstile on the subway. Turns out, it was just announced recently that in New York City, 90% of the people who get arrested for this are black or Hispanic. Oh gosh, we can't have that. Must be more stereotyping. So the solution is to make fare beating no longer an arrestable offense. And that is precisely what Cyrus Vance, District Attorney of Manhattan, has announced in February that he's going to do. There may be civil summonses, but no more arrests, because we were arresting too many non-whites. In 2016, California decriminalized fare beating for anyone under age 18. San Francisco did the same thing in 2008, Seattle in 2015. In every case, the reason was we cannot have rules and enforce rules if the people who are punished for violating these rules are overwhelmingly non-white. And here's another example. Everyone knows that blacks and Hispanics get school discipline at far higher rates than whites. Well, Barack Obama and Eric Holder concluded that there was only one explanation to this, and this is racism. And as you may recall, he issued this Dear Colleague letter to all the people who run all the school districts in America, threatening to withhold federal funds if people had these disparate discipline rates, which is to say, every school district. Well, that's why in 2009, St. Paul, Minnesota, they decided they were going to solve the problem by hiring somebody named Valeria Silva as the superintendent of schools. She put everybody through sensitivity training, and she issued orders from on high. Those discipline rates could not vary according to race. So what's the solution? You can't start suspending white people for no reason at all, so you end up stopping black and Hispanic suspensions, stop suspending them for even the best of reasons. And what are the consequences? Of course, chaos. Teachers going to the emergency room, an utterly ungovernable classroom, one after another. And what this led to was a citizen revolt. They had to vote in a brand new school board, which finally, after 6.5 years of misery, fired Valeria Silva, and they got discipline back in their schools again. Of course, it cost them $800,000 to buy out Valeria Silva's contract, but it was worth it to be able to discipline with racial disparity once again and have schools that worked. There were similar stories all around the country, but the idea was blacks and Hispanics can't follow the rules, so ditch the rules. And we all remember Nicholas Cruz, who killed 17 people in Parkland, Florida. He was, of course, part of what they call the Promise program. The idea was we're just not going to report crimes to the police because we want to stop the school to prison pipeline that is another notorious black mark of America. So despite the fact that he had crimes, he'd committed crimes, he wasn't reported to the police, he didn't have a criminal record, was able to buy a gun, and as a consequence, 17 people dead. But now we're not talking about racial disparities of any kind, we're talking about gun control. That's the obvious solution, because when it comes to race, otherwise intelligent people, as I said before, act like morons. Then another example of this is the 2008 financial crisis. President George Bush, some years previously, had decided that blacks and Hispanics were not getting the mortgages they deserved. And so, to make sure that they did, bankers were essentially ordered to junk the usual creditworthy standards. But if you were going to give mortgages to blacks or Hispanics that were not going to make a down payment, who had no obvious or provable source of income, you couldn't turn away white deadbeats either. And the consequence, no surprise, was lots of defaults. And what we know as the minority mortgage meltdown, of course, is studiously ignored in all other circles. One last example. The University of Virginia, ever since its founding, has had an honor code. You're not allowed to lie, cheat, or steal, and such people are supposed to be expelled. Well, one student reported to the school newspaper, "Most of my African American friends view the honor system as something negative, almost like a boogeyman to be afraid of." Well, as it turns out, blacks are about 5 times more likely to violate the honor system. And interestingly enough, Asians aren't all that honorable either by UVA standards. And so the question always keeps coming up. Is the honor system, because of this disparate impact, an antiquated, racist, white supremacist thing? Well, it survives now, but we'll see how much longer. And so to conclude, in this attempt to build a multiracial country, there have been many unfortunate, even tragic consequences, and I've talked only about 3. First, there's this growing number of non-whites who hate us. And if they hate us in the America of 2018, they are always going to hate us. They are not going to ever be happy with us. Second is this attempt to build a multiracial society drives a certain number of white people literally insane, like the people who run Starbucks. And third, we are bit by bit beginning to dismantle the standards by which we run our societies, but standards that others are not able to meet. So what do we do? Well, first of all, the non-whites who complain about us so bitterly, if they had any integrity, they would be asking for a divorce. Ta-Nehisi Coates says we're hopeless. Ika Yanka tells her children we can't be trusted. Assad Haider would love to get rid of us. Don't they have the courage of their convictions? Why aren't they asking for separation? And for all these Black Lives Matter people who claim to believe that white people are just white police officers just cruising around their neighborhoods looking for black people to shoot, why aren't they asking for separation? And I don't mean safe spaces for people of color and blacks only dormitories that we'd have to pay for. Anyway, I'm talking about the real thing. Parts of states, parts of the country, a fair division where they could run the schools and the police departments and where they wouldn't have to worry about white people ever again. Wouldn't that be paradise for them? Well, why don't they ever ask for this paradise? Well, I suspect Ta-Nehisi Coates would miss getting his royalty payments. I think he'd probably have nothing to write about if he weren't living with us. And if the people of color had their own places, it wouldn't be just the schools and the police force they'd have to run. Somebody would have to keep the electrical grid functioning and keep the bridges from falling down. And white people are kind of handy for that kind of thing. And so I think in their bones, they know they are much better off keeping us around to play certain roles. We, though, we should take them at their word. We should be saying, if we are really as awful as you say, let's figure out some way for you to live apart from us. You say that we keep you on the plantation? Well, go plant your own plantation and take your destiny in your own hands.